This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography.
Produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 61, Desolation. And I yearn to lay my head where the grass is cool and sweet. Mother, all the dreams are fled from the tired child at thy feet. April came. Rumors reached me in my cell in Alipore of happenings outside, rumors that were unpleasant and disturbing. The superintendent of the jail informed me casually one day that Mr. Gandhi had withdrawn civil disobedience. I knew no more. The news was not welcome, and I felt sad at this winding up of something that had meant so much to me for many years. And yet I reasoned with myself that the end was bound to come. I knew in my heart that some time or other civil disobedience would have to be wound up, for the time being at least. Individuals may hold out almost indefinitely, regardless of the consequences, but national organizations do not behave in this manner. I had no doubt that Gandhiji had interpreted correctly the mind of the country and of the great majority of congressmen, and I tried to reconcile myself to the new development, unpleasant as it was. I heard also vaguely of the new move to revive the old Swaraj party in order to enter the legislatures. That too seemed inevitable, and I had long been of opinion that the Congress could not keep aloof from future elections. During the 5 months of my freedom outside prison, I had tried to discourage this tendency, for I thought it premature and likely to divert attention both from direct action and from the development of new ideas of social change which were fermenting in the Congress ranks. The longer the crisis continued, I thought, the more would these ideas spread among our masses and intelligentsia, and the realities underlying our political and economic situation be laid bare. As Lenin has said somewhere, any and every political crisis is useful because it brings to the light what was hidden, reveals the actual forces involved in politics, it exposes lies and deceptive phrases and fictions, it demonstrates comprehensively the facts, and forces on the people the understanding of what is the reality. I had hoped that this process would result in making the Congress a clearer-minded and a more compact body with a definite goal. Probably some of its weaker elements might drop out. That would be no loss. And when the time came for the ending of even theoretical direct action and a reversion to so-called constitutional and legal methods, the advanced and really active wing of the Congress would utilize even these methods from the larger point of view of our final objective. That time apparently had come. But to my dismay, I found that the people who had been the backbone of civil disobedience and effective work in the Congress were receding into the background, and others who had taken no such part were taking command. Some days later, the Weekly Statesman came to me, and I read in it the statement which Gandhiji had issued when withdrawing civil disobedience. I read it with amazement and sinking of heart. Again and again I read it, and civil disobedience and much else vanished from my mind, and other doubts and conflicts filled it. This statement, wrote Gandhiji, owes its inspiration to a personal chat with the inmates and associates of the Satyagraha Ashram. More especially is it due to a revealing information I got in the course of a conversation about a valued companion of long standing who was found reluctant to perform the full prison task, preferring his private studies to the allotted task. This was undoubtedly contrary to the rules of Satyagraha. More than the imperfection of the friend whom I love, more than ever it brought home to me my own imperfections. The friend said he had thought that I was aware of his weakness. I was blind. Blindness in a leader is unpardonable. I saw at once that I must for the time being remain the sole representative of civil resistance in action. The imperfection or fault, if such it was, of the friend was a very trivial affair. I confess that I have often been guilty of it, and I am wholly unrepentant. But even if it was a serious matter, was a vast national movement involving scores of thousands directly and millions indirectly to be thrown out of gear because an individual had erred. This seemed to me a monstrous proposition and an immoral one. I cannot presume to speak of what is and what is not satyagraha, but in my own little way I have endeavored to follow certain standards of conduct, and all those standards were shocked and upset by this statement of Gandhiji's. I knew that Gandhiji usually acts on instinct. I prefer to call it that than the inner voice or an answer to prayer, and very often that instinct is right. He has repeatedly shown what a wonderful knack he has of sensing the mass mind and of acting at the psychological moment. The reasons which he afterwards adduces to justify his action are usually afterthoughts and seldom carry one very far. A leader or a man of action in a crisis almost always acts subconsciously and then thinks of the reasons for his action. I felt also that Gandhiji had acted rightly in suspending civil resistance, but the reason he had given seemed to me an insult to intelligence and an amazing performance for a leader of a national movement. He was perfectly entitled to treat his ashram inmates in any manner he liked. They had taken all kinds of pledges and accepted a certain regime. But the Congress had not done so. I had not done so. Why should we be tossed hither and thither for what seemed to me metaphysical and mystical reasons in which I was not interested? Was it conceivable to have any political movement on this basis? I had willingly accepted the moral aspect of satyagraha, as I understood it, within certain limits, I admit. That basic aspect appealed to me, and it seemed to raise politics to a higher and nobler level. I was prepared to agree that the end does not justify all kinds of means. But this new development or interpretation was something much more far-reaching, and it held forth some possibilities which frightened me. The whole statement frightened and oppressed me tremendously. And then finally the advice he gave to congressmen was that they must learn the art and beauty of self-denial and voluntary poverty. They must engage themselves in nation-building activities, the spread of candid through personal hand-spinning and hand-weaving, the spread of communal unity of hearts by irreproachable personal conduct towards one another in every walk of life, the banishing of untouchability in every shape or form in one's own person, the spread of total abstinence from intoxicating drinks and drugs by personal contact with individual addicts, and generally by cultivating personal purity. These are services which provide maintenance on the poor man's scale. Those for whom the poor man's scale is not feasible should find a place in small unorganized industries of national importance which give a better wage. This was the political program that we were to follow. A vast distance seemed to separate him from me. With a stab of pain, I felt that the cords of allegiance that had bound me to him for many years had snapped. For long a mental tussle had been going on within me. I had not understood or appreciated much that Gandhiji had done. His fasts and his concentration on other issues during the continuance of civil disobedience, when his comrades were in the grip of the struggle, his personal and self-created entanglements, which led him to the extraordinary position that, while out of prison, he was yet pledged to himself not to take part in the political movement. His new loyalties and pledges which put in the shade the old loyalty and pledge and job, undertaken together with many colleagues, while yet that job was unfinished, had all oppressed me. During my short period out of prison, I had felt these and other differences more than ever. Gandhiji had stated that there were temperamental differences between us. They were perhaps more than temperamental, and I realized that I held clear and definite views about many matters which were opposed to his. And yet in the past I had tried to subordinate them, as far as I could, to what I conceived to be the larger loyalty, the cause of national freedom for which the Congress seemed to be working. I tried to be loyal and faithful to my leader and my colleagues, for in my spiritual make-up loyalty to a cause and to one's colleagues holds a high place. I fought many a battle within myself when I felt that I was being dragged away from the anchor of my spiritual faith. Somehow I managed to compromise. Perhaps I did wrong, for it can never be right for anyone to let go of that anchor. But in the conflict of ideals, I clung to my loyalty to my colleagues, and hoped that the rush of events and the development of our struggle might dissolve the difficulties that troubled me and bring my colleagues nearer to my viewpoint. And now, suddenly I felt very lonely in that cell of Alipore jail. Life seemed to be a dreary affair, a very wilderness of desolation. Of the many hard lessons that I had learnt, the hardest and the most painful now faced me, that it is not possible in any vital matter to rely on anyone. One must journey through life alone. To rely on others is to invite heartbreak. Some of my accumulated irritation turned to religion and the religious outlook. What an enemy this was to clearness of thought and fixity of purpose, I thought, for was it not based on emotion and passion? Presuming to be spiritual, how far removed it was from real spirituality and things of the spirit. Thinking in terms of some other world, it had little conception of human values and social justice. With its preconceived notions, it deliberately shut its eyes to reality for fear that this might not fit in with them. It based itself on truth, and yet so sure was it of having discovered it, and the whole of it, that it did not take the trouble to search for it. All that concerned it was to tell others of it. The will to truth was not the same thing as the will to believe. It talked of peace, and yet supported systems and organizations that could not exist but for violence. It condemned the violence of the sword, but what of the violence that comes quietly and often in peaceful garb and starves and kills, or worse still, without doing any outward physical injury, outrages the mind and crushes the spirit and breaks the heart? And then I thought of him again, who was the cause of this commotion within me. What a wonderful man was Gandhiji after all, with his amazing and almost irresistible charm and subtle power over people. His writings and his sayings conveyed little enough impression of the man behind. His personality was far bigger than they would lead one to think, and his services to India, how vast they had been. He had instilled courage and manhood in her people, and discipline and endurance, and the power of joyful sacrifice for a cause, and, with all his humility, pride. Courage is the one sure foundation of character, he had said. Without courage there is no morality, no religion, no love. One cannot follow truth or love so long as one is subject to fear. With all his horror of violence, he had told us that cowardice is a thing even more hateful than violence. And discipline is the pledge and guarantee that a man means business. There is no deliverance and no hope without sacrifice, discipline, and self-control. Mere sacrifice without discipline will be unavailing. Words only and pious phrases, perhaps, rather platitudinous, but there was power behind the words, and India knew that this little man meant business. He came to represent India to an amazing degree, and to express the very spirit of that ancient and tortured land. Almost he was India, and his very failings were Indian failings. As light to him was hardly a personal matter, it was an insult to the nation, and viceroys and others who indulged in these disdainful gestures little realized what a dangerous crop they were sowing. I remember how hurt I was when I first learnt that the Pope had refused an interview to Gandhiji when he was returning from the Round Table Conference in 1847 December 1931. That refusal seemed to me an affront to India, and there can be no doubt that the refusal was intentional, though the affront was probably not thought of. The Catholic Church does not approve of saints or Mahatmas outside its fold, and because some Protestant churchmen had called Gandhiji a great man of religion and a real Christian, it became all the more necessary for Rome to dissociate itself from this heresy. Just about that time in Alipore jail, in April 1934, I read Bernard Shaw's new plays, and the preface to On the Rocks, with its debate between Christ and Pilate, fascinated me. It seemed to have a modern significance when another empire faced another man of religion. I say to you, Jesus says to Pilate in this preface, cast out fear. Speak no more vain things to me about the greatness of Rome. The greatness of Rome, as you call it, is nothing but fear. Fear of the past and fear of the future, fear of the poor, fear of the rich, fear of the high priests, fear of the Jews and Greeks who are learned, fear of the Gauls and Goths and Huns, who are barbarians, fear of the Carthage you destroyed to save you from fear of it, and now fear worse than ever, fear of imperial Caesar, the idol you have yourself created, and fear of me, the penniless vagrant, buffeted and mocked, fear of everything except the rule of God, faith in nothing but blood and iron and gold. You, standing for Rome, are the universal coward. I, standing for the kingdom of God, have braved everything, lost everything, and won an eternal crown. But Gandhiji's greatness, or his services to India, or the tremendous debt I personally owed to him were not in question. In spite of all that, he might be hopelessly in the wrong in many matters. What, after all, was he aiming at? In spite of the closest association with him for many years, I am not clear in my own mind about his objective. I doubt if he is clear himself. One step enough for me, he says, and he does not try to peep into the future or to have a clearly conceived end before him. Look after the means, and the end will take care of itself, he is never tired of repeating. Be good in your personal individual lives, and all else will follow. That is not a political or scientific attitude, nor is it perhaps even an ethical attitude. It is narrowly moralist, and it begs the question, what is goodness? Is it merely an individual affair or a social affair? Gandhiji lays all stress on character and attaches little importance to intellectual training and development. Intellect without character is likely to be dangerous, but what is character without intellect? How indeed does character develop? Gandhiji has been compared to the medieval Christian saints, and much that he says seems to fit in with this. It does not fit in at all with modern psychological experience and method. But however this may be, vagueness in an objective seems to me deplorable. Action to be effective must be directed to clearly conceived ends. Life is not all logic, and those ends will have to be varied from time to time to fit in with it. But some end must always be clearly envisaged. I imagine that Gandhiji is not so vague about the objective as he sometimes appears to be. He is passionately desirous of going in a certain direction, but this is wholly at variance with modern ideas and conditions, and he has so far been unable to fit the two, or to chalk out all the intermediate steps leading to his goal. Hence, the appearance of vagueness and avoidance of clarity. But his general inclination has been clear enough for a quarter of a century, ever since he started formulating his philosophy in South Africa. I do not know if those early writings still represent his views. I doubt if they do so in their entirety, but they do help us to understand the background of his thought. India's salvation consists, he wrote in 1909, in unlearning what she has learned during the last 50 years. The railways, telegraphs, hospitals, lawyers, doctors, and such like have all to go, and the so-called upper classes have to learn consciously, religiously, and deliberately the simple peasant life, knowing it to be a life-giving true happiness. And again, every time I get into a railway car or use a motor bus, I know that I am doing violence to my sense of what is right. To attempt to reform the world by means of highly artificial and speedy locomotion is to attempt the impossible. All this seems to me utterly wrong and harmful doctrine and impossible of achievement. Behind it lies Gandhiji's love and praise of poverty and suffering and the ascetic life. For him, progress and civilization consist not in the multiplication of wants, of higher standards of living, but in the deliberate and voluntary restriction of wants, which promotes real happiness and contentment and increases the capacity for service. If these premises are once accepted, it becomes easy to follow the rest of Gandhiji's thought and to have a better understanding of his activities. But most of us do not accept those premises, and yet we complain later on when we find that his activities are not to our liking. Personally, I dislike the praise of poverty and suffering. I do not think they are at all desirable, and they ought to be abolished. Nor do I appreciate the ascetic life as a social ideal, though it may suit individuals. I understand and appreciate simplicity, equality, self-control, but not the mortification of the flesh. Just as an athlete requires to train his body, I believe that the mind and habits have also to be trained and brought under control. It would be absurd to expect that a person who is given to too much self-indulgence can endure much suffering, or show unusual self-control, or behave like a hero when the crisis comes. To be in good moral condition requires at least as much training as to be in good physical condition. But that certainly does not mean asceticism or self-mortification, nor do I appreciate in the least the idealization of the simple peasant life. I have almost a horror of it, and instead of submitting to it myself, I want to drag out even the peasantry from it, not to urbanization, but to the spread of urban cultural facilities to rural areas. Far from this life giving me true happiness, it would be almost as bad as imprisonment for me. What is there in the man with the hoe to idealize over? Crushed and exploited for innumerable generations, he is only little removed from the animals who keep him company. Who made him dead to rapture and despair, a thing that grieves not and that never hopes, stolid and stunned, a brother to the ox? This desire to get away from the mind of man to primitive conditions where mind does not count seems to me quite incomprehensible. The very thing that is the glory and triumph of man is decried and discouraged, and a physical environment which will oppress the mind and prevent its growth is considered desirable. Present-day civilization is full of evils, but it is also full of good, and it has the capacity in it to rid itself of those evils. To destroy it, root and branch, is to remove that capacity from it and revert to a dull, sunless, and miserable existence. But even if that were desirable, it is an impossible undertaking. We cannot stop the river of change or cut ourselves adrift from it, and psychologically we who have eaten of the apple of Eden cannot forget that taste and go back to primitiveness. It is difficult to argue this, for the two standpoints are utterly different. Gandhiji is always thinking in terms of personal salvation and of sin, while most of us have society's welfare uppermost in our minds. I find it difficult to grasp the idea of sin, and perhaps it is because of this that I cannot appreciate Gandhiji's general outlook. He is not out to change society or the social structure. He devotes himself to the eradication of sin from individuals. The follower of Swadeshi, he has written, never takes upon himself the vain task of trying to reform the world, for he believes that the world is moved and always will be moved according to the rules set by God. And yet he is aggressive enough in his attempts to reform the world, but the reform he aims at is individual reform, the conquest over the senses and the desire to indulge them, which is sin. Probably he will agree with the definition of liberty which an able Roman Catholic writer on fascism has given. Liberty is no more than freedom from the bondage of sin. How almost identical this is with the words of the Bishop of London written 200 years ago. The freedom which Christianity gives is freedom from the bondage of sin and Satan, and from the dominion of men's lusts and passions and inordinate desires. Footnote. This letter is quoted on page 378, ante. End of footnote. If this standpoint is once appreciated, then one begins to understand a little Gandhiji's attitude to sex, extraordinary as that seems to the average person today. For him, any union is a crime when the desire for progeny is absent, and the adoption of artificial methods must result in imbecility and nervous prostration. It is wrong and immoral to seek to escape the consequences of one's acts. It is bad for him to indulge his appetite and then escape the consequences by taking tonics or other medicines. It is still worse for a person to indulge his animal passions and escape the consequences of his acts. Personally, I find this attitude unnatural and shocking, and if he is right, then I am a criminal on the verge of imbecility and nervous prostration. The Roman Catholics have also vigorously opposed birth control, but they have not carried their argument to the logical limit as Gandhiji has done. They have temporized and compromised with what they considered to be human nature. Footnote. Pope Pius XI, in his encyclical on Christian marriage, issued on December 31st, 1931, says, "Nor must married people be considered to act against the order of nature if they make use of their rights according to sound and natural reason, even though no new life can thence arise on account of circumstance of time or the existence of some defect." The circumstance of time apparently refers to the so-called safe period when conception is unlikely. End of footnote. But Gandhiji has gone to the extreme limit of his argument and does not recognize the validity or necessity of the sexual act at any time except for the sake of children. He refuses to recognize any natural sex attraction between man and woman. "But I am told," he says, "that this is an impossible ideal, that I do not take account of the natural attraction between man and woman. I refuse to believe that the sensual affinity referred to here can be at all regarded as natural. In that case the deluge would soon be over us. The natural affinity between man and woman is the attraction between brother and sister, mother and son, or father and daughter. It is this natural attraction that sustains the world." And more emphatically still, "No, I must declare with all the power I can command that sensual attraction, even between husband and wife, is unnatural." In these days of the Oedipus complex and Freud and the spread of psychoanalytical ideas, this emphatic statement of belief sounds strange and distant. One can accept it as an act of faith or reject it. There is no halfway house, for it is a question of faith, not of reason. For my part, I think Gandhiji is absolutely wrong in this matter. His advice may fit in with some cases, but as a general policy it can only lead to frustration, inhibition, neurosis, and all manner of physical and nervous ills. Sexual restraint was certainly desirable, but I doubt if Gandhiji's doctrine is likely to result in this to any widespread extent. It is too extreme, and most people decide that it is beyond their capacity and go their usual ways, or there is friction between husband and wife. Evidently, Gandhiji thinks that birth control methods necessarily mean inordinate indulgence in the sex act, and that if the sexual affinity between man and woman is admitted, every man will run after every woman, and vice versa. Neither inference is justified, and I do not know why he is so obsessed by this problem of sex, important as it is. For him it is a soot or whitewash question. There are no intermediate shades. At either end he takes up an extreme position which seems to me most abnormal and unnatural. Perhaps this is a reaction from the deluge of literature on sexology that is descending on us in these days. I presume I am a normal individual and sex has played its part in my life, but it has not obsessed me or diverted me from my other activities. It has been a subordinate part. Essentially, his attitude is that of the ascetic who has turned his back to the world and its ways, who denies life and considers it evil. For an ascetic that is natural, but it seems far-fetched to apply it to men and women of the world who accept life and try to make the most of it. And in avoiding one evil, he puts up with many other and graver evils. I have drifted to other topics, but in those distressful days in Alipore jail, all these ideas crowded in my mind, not in logical order or sequence, but in a wild jumble which confused me and oppressed me. Above all, there was the feeling of loneliness and desolation, heightened by the stifling atmosphere of the jail and my lonely little cell. If I had been outside, the shock would have been more momentary, and I would have adjusted myself sooner to new conditions and found relief in expression and action. Inside the prison there was no such relief, and I spent some miserable days. Fortunately for myself, I am resilient and recover soon from attacks of pessimism. I began to grow out of my depression, and then I had an interview in jail with Kamla. That cheered me up tremendously, and my feeling of isolation left me. Whatever happened, I felt we had one another. End of Chapter 61. Chapter 62. Paradoxes. People who do not know Gandhiji personally and have only read his writings are apt to think that he is a priestly type, extremely puritanical, long-faced, Calvinistic, and a killjoy, something like the priests in black gowns walking their rounds. But his writings do him an injustice. He is far greater than what he writes, and it is not quite fair to quote what he has written and criticize it. He is the very opposite of the Calvinistic priestly type. His smile is delightful, his laughter infectious, and he radiates light-heartedness. There is something childlike about him, which is full of charm. When he enters a room he brings a breath of fresh air with him, which lightens the atmosphere. He is an extraordinary paradox. I suppose all outstanding men are so to some extent. For years I have puzzled over this problem. Why, with all his love and solicitude for the underdog, he yet supports a system which inevitably produces it and crushes it? Why, with all his passion for non-violence, he is in favor of a political and social structure which is wholly based on violence and coercion? Perhaps it is not correct to say that he is in favor of such a system. He is more or less of a philosophical anarchist, but as the ideal anarchist state is too far off still and cannot easily be conceived, he accepts the present order. It is not, I think, a question of means that he objects, as he does, to the use of violence in bringing about a change. Quite apart from the methods to be adopted for changing the existing order, an ideal objective can be envisaged, something that is possible of achievement in the not distant future. Sometimes he calls himself a socialist, but he uses the word in a sense peculiar to himself, which has little or nothing to do with the economic framework of society, which usually goes by the name of socialism. Following his lead, a number of prominent congressmen have taken to the use of that word, meaning thereby a kind of muddled humanitarianism. They err in distinguished company in the use of this vague political terminology, for they are but following the example of the Prime Minister of the British National Government. Footnote: Mr. Ramsay MacDonald, in the course of his message to the Federation of Conservative and Unionist Associations at Edinburgh in January 1935, said, "The difficulties of the times make integration and concentration essential for every people. This is the true socialism, as it is also the true nationalism, and, for that matter, the true individualism." End of footnote. I know that Gandhiji is not ignorant of the subject, for he has read many books on economics and socialism and even Marxism, and has discussed it with others. But I am becoming more and more convinced that in vital matters the mind by itself does not carry us far. "If your heart does not want to," said William James, "your head will assuredly never make you believe." The emotions govern the general outlook and control the mind. Our conversations, whether they are religious, political, or economic, are really based on emotion or instinct. As Schopenhauer has said, man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he will will. Gandhiji underwent a tremendous conversion during his early days in South Africa, and this shook him up greatly and altered his whole outlook on life. Since then, he has had a fixed basis for all his ideas, and his mind is hardly an open mind. He listens with the greatest patience and attention to people who make new suggestions to him, but behind all his courteous interest, one has the impression that one is addressing a closed door. He is so firmly anchored to some ideas that everything else seems unimportant. To insist on other and secondary matters would be a distraction and a distortion of the larger scheme. To hold on to that anchor would necessarily result in a proper adjustment of these other matters. If the means are right, the end is bound to be right. That, I think, is the main background of his thought. He suspects also socialism, and more particularly Marxism, because of their association with violence. The very words class war breathe conflict and violence and are thus repugnant to him. He has also no desire to raise the standards of the masses beyond a certain very modest competence, for higher standards and leisure may lead to self-indulgence and sin. It is bad enough that the handful of the well-to-do are self-indulgent. It would be much worse if their numbers were added to. Some such inference can be drawn from a letter he wrote in 1926. This was in answer to a letter that came to him from England during the great coal lockout or strike. His correspondent was advancing the argument that the miners will be beaten in the struggle because there are too many of them, and they should therefore use contraceptives and limit their numbers. In the course of his reply, Gandhiji said, "Lastly, if the mine owners are in the wrong and still win, they will do so not because the miners overbreed, but because the miners have not learnt the lesson of restraint all along the line. If the miners had no children, they would have no incentive for any betterment and no provable cause for a rise in wages. Need they drink, gamble, smoke? Will it be any answer to say that mine owners do all these things and yet have the upper hand? If the miners do not claim to be better than the capitalist, what right have they to ask for the world's sympathy? Is it to multiply capitalists and strengthen capitalism? We are called upon to pay homage to democracy under a promise of a better world when it reigns supreme. Let us not reproduce on a vast scale the evils we choose to ascribe to capitalist and capitalism." This letter is quoted in Self-Restraint versus Self-Indulgence by M.K. Gandhi. As I read this, the starved and pinched faces of the English miners and their wives and children came before me as I had seen them in that summer of 1926, struggling helplessly and pitifully against the monstrous system that crushed them. Gandhiji's facts are not quite correct, for the miners were not asking for a rise in wages. They were fighting against a reduction and had been locked out. But this need not concern us now, nor need the question of the use of contraceptives by miners concern us, although it was a somewhat remarkable suggestion for the solution of industrial conflicts. I have quoted from Gandhiji's reply to help in the understanding of his outlook on labor matters and the usual demand for a rise in the workers' standard of living. That outlook is as far removed from the socialistic, or for the matter of that the capitalistic, as anything can be. To say that science and industrial technique today can demonstrably feed, clothe, and house everybody and raise their standards of living very greatly, if vested interest did not intervene, does not interest him much, for he is not keen on those results beyond a certain limit. The promise of socialism therefore holds no attraction for him, and capitalism is only partly tolerable because it circumscribes the evil. He dislikes both, but puts up with the latter for the present as a lesser evil and as something which exists and of which he has to take cognizance. I may be wrong perhaps in imputing these ideas to him, but I do feel that he tends to think in this manner, and the paradoxes and confusions in his utterances that trouble us are really due to entirely different premises from which he starts. He does not want people to make an ideal of over-increasing comfort and leisure, but to think of the moral life, give up their bad habits, to indulge themselves less and less, and thus to develop themselves individually and spiritually. And those who wish to serve the masses have not so much to raise them materially as to go down themselves to their level and mix with them on equal terms. In so doing, inevitably, they will help in raising them somewhat. That, according to him, is true democracy. "Many have despaired of resisting me," he writes in a statement he issued on the 17th of September, 1934. "This is a humiliating revelation to me, a born Democrat. I make that claim if complete identification with the poorest of mankind, longing to live no better than they, and a corresponding conscious effort to approach that level to the best of one's ability, can entitle one to make it. With this argument and outlook, probably no modern Democrat, capitalist, or socialist will agree, except in so far as it is indecent and improper to cut ourselves off from the masses and flaunt our luxury and far higher standards in the faces of the vast majority of those who lack the barest necessities. But a man with the old religious outlook may find some agreement, for both are emotionally tied up with the past and are always thinking in terms of that past. They think more of what has been than of what is, or what is going to be. There is all the difference in the world between the psychological urge to the past and to the future. In the old world, it was difficult to think of raising the general material level of the masses. The poor were always with us. The handful of rich men were then an essential part of the social fabric. They were necessary to the productive system. And so the moralist, the reformer, and the sensitive man accepted them, but at the same time tried to impress them with their obligations to their needy brethren. They were to be the trustees of the poor, they were to be charitable, and charity became one of the major virtues ordained by religion. Gandhiji is always laying stress on this idea of trusteeship of the feudal prince, of the big landlord, of the capitalist. He follows a long succession of men of religion. The Pope has declared that the rich must consider themselves the servants of the Almighty, as well as the guardians and the distributors of His wealth, to whom Jesus Christ Himself entrusted the fate of the poor. Popular Hinduism and Islam repeat this idea and are always calling upon the rich to be charitable, and they respond by building temples or mosques or dharamshalas, or giving, out of their abundance, coppers or silver to the poor, and feeling very virtuous in consequence. A striking passage illustrating this old-world religious attitude occurs in the famous encyclical Rerum Novarum of Pope Leo XIII, issued in May 1891. Continuing his argument dealing with the new industrial conditions, he says, "To suffer and to endure, therefore, is the lot of humanity. Let men try as they may, no strength and no artifice will ever succeed in banishing from human life the ills and troubles which beset it. If any there are who pretend differently, who hold out to a hard-pressed people freedom from pain and trouble, undisturbed repose and constant enjoyment, they cheat the people and impose upon them, and their lying promises will only make the evil worse than before. There is nothing more useful than to look at the world as it really is, and at the same time look elsewhere for a remedy to its troubles." Further on we are told where this elsewhere is. "The things of the earth cannot be understood or valued rightly without taking into consideration the life to come, the life that will last forever. The great truth which we learn from nature herself is also the grand Christian dogma on which religion rests as on its base. That when we have done with this present life, then we shall really begin to live. God has not created us for the perishable and transitory things of the earth, but for things heavenly and everlasting. He has given us the world as a place of exile, and not as our true country. Money and the other things which men call good and desirable, we may have them in abundance, or we may want them altogether. As far as eternal happiness is concerned, it is no matter. This religious attitude is bound up with the world of long ago, when the only possible escape from present misery was in the hope of a world to come. But though conditions changed and raised the human level in material prosperity beyond the wildest dreams of the past, the stranglehold of that past continued, the stress now being laid on certain vague, unmeasurable spiritual values. The Catholics look back to the 12th and 13th centuries, the very period which is called the Dark Age by others, as the golden age of Christianity, when saints flourished and Christian rulers sallied forth to fight in the Crusades, and Gothic cathedrals grew up. That was the age, according to them, of true Christian democracy, which was then realized under the control of the medieval guilds, more fully than it has ever been before or since. Muslims look back with longing to the democracy of Islam under the early caliphs, and to their amazing career of victory. Hindus think likewise of the Vedic and epic periods and dream of a Ramraj. And yet all history tells us that the great masses of the people lived in utter misery in those past days, lacking food and the barest necessaries of life. A handful of people at the top may have indulged in the spiritual life, having leisure and means to do so, but for the others, it is difficult to imagine them doing anything but struggling for bare sustenance. To a person who is starving, cultural and spiritual progress is highly unlikely. His thoughts will be concentrated on food and how to get it. The industrial age has brought many evils that loom large before us. But we are apt to forget that, taking the world as a whole, and especially the parts that are most industrialized, it has laid down a basis of material well-being which makes cultural and spiritual progress far easier for large numbers. This is not all evident in India or other colonial countries, as we have not profited by industrialism. We have only been exploited by it, and in many respects made worse, even materially, and more so culturally and spiritually. The fault is not of industrialism, but of foreign domination. The so-called Westernization in India has actually, for the time being, strengthened feudalism, and instead of solving any of our problems, has simply intensified them. That has been our misfortune, and we must not allow it to color our vision of the world today. For under present conditions, the rich man is no longer a necessary or a desirable part of the productive system or of society as a whole. He is redundant, and he is always coming in the way. And the old business of the priest to ask the rich to be charitable and the poor to be resigned, grateful for their lot, thrifty and well-behaved, has lost its meaning. Human resources have grown tremendously and can face and solve the world's problems. Many of the rich have become definitely parasitical, and the existence of a parasite class is not only a hindrance, but an enormous waste of these resources. That class, and the system that breeds them, actually prevent work and production, and encourage the workless at either end of the scale, both those who live on other people's labor and those who have no work to do and famish. Gandhiji himself wrote some time ago, "To a people famishing and idle, the only acceptable form in which God dare appear is work and promise of food as wages." God created man to work for his food, and said that those who ate without work were thieves. To try to understand the complex problems of the modern world by an application of ancient methods and formulae when these problems did not exist, to use out-of-date phrases in regard to them, is to produce confusion and to invite failure. The very idea of private property, which seems to some people one of the fundamental notions of the world, has been an ever-changing one. Slaves were property at one time, and so were women and children, the seigneur's right to the bride's first night, roads, temples, ferries, bridges, public utilities, air and land. Animals are still property, though legislation has in many countries limited the rights of ownership. During wartime, there is a continuous infringement of property rights. Property today is becoming more and more intangible, the possession of shares, a certain amount of credit, etc. As the conception of property changes, the state interferes more and more, public opinion demands, and the law enforces a limitation of the anarchic rights of property owners. All manner of heavy taxes, which are in the nature of confiscation, swallow up individual property rights for the public good. The public good becomes the basis of public policy, and a man may not act contrary to this public good even to protect his property rights. After all, the vast majority of people had no property rights in the past. They were themselves property owned by others. Even today, a very small number have such rights. We hear a great deal of vested interests. Today, a new vested interest has come to be recognized, that of every man and woman to live and labor and enjoy the fruits of labor. Because of these changing conceptions, property and capital do not vanish, they are diffused, and the power over others, which a concentration of them gave to a few, is taken back by society as a whole. Gandhiji wants to improve the individual internally, morally, and spiritually, and thereby to change the external environment. He wants people to give up bad habits and indulgences and to become pure. He lays stress on sexual abstinence, on the giving up of drink, smoking, etc. Opinions may differ about the relative wickedness of these indulgences, but can there be any doubt that even from the individual point of view, and much more so from the social, these personal failings are less harmful than covetousness, selfishness, acquisitiveness, the fierce conflicts of individuals for personal gain, the ruthless struggles of groups and classes, the inhuman suppression and exploitation of one group by another, the terrible wars between nations? Of course he detests all this violence and degrading conflict, but are they not inherent in the acquisitive society of today, with its law that the strong must prey on the weak, and its motto that, as of old, they shall take who have the power and they shall keep who can? The profit motive today inevitably leads to conflict. The whole system protects and gives every scope to man's predatory instincts. It encourages some finer instincts, no doubt, but much more so the baser instincts of man. Success means the knocking down of others and mounting on their vanquished selves. If these motives and ambitions are encouraged by society and attract the best of our people, does Gandhiji think that he can achieve his ideal, the moral man, in this environment? He wants to develop the spirit of service. He will succeed in the case of some individuals. But so long as society puts forward as exemplars the victors of an acquisitive society, and the chief urge as the personal profit motive, the vast majority will follow this course. But the problem is no longer merely a moral or an ethical one. It is a practical and urgent problem of today, for the world is in a hopeless muddle and some way out must be found. We cannot wait Micawber-like for something to turn up. Nor can we live by negation alone, criticizing the evil aspects of capitalism, socialism, communism, etc., and hoping vaguely for the golden mean, which will produce a happy compromise combining the best features of all systems, old and new. The malady has to be diagnosed and the cure suggested and worked for. It is quite certain that we cannot stand where we are, nationally and internationally. We may try to go back, or we may push forward. Probably there is no choice in the matter, for going back seems inconceivable. And yet many of Gandhiji's activities might lead one to think that he wants to go back to the narrowest autarky, not only a self-sufficient nation, but almost a self-sufficient village. In primitive communities, the village was more or less self-sufficient and fed and clothed itself and otherwise provided for its needs. Of necessity, that means an extremely low standard of living. I do not think Gandhiji is permanently aiming at this, for it is an impossible objective. The huge populations of today would not be able even to subsist in some countries. They would not tolerate this reversion to scarcity and starvation. It is possible, I think, that in an agricultural country like India, so very low is our present standard, that there might be a slight improvement for the masses with the development of village industries. But we are tied up, as every country is tied up, with the rest of the world, and it seems to me quite impossible for us to cut adrift. We must think, therefore, in terms of the world, and in these terms a narrow autarky is out of the question. Personally, I consider it undesirable from every point of view. Inevitably, we are led to the only possible solution, the establishment of a socialist order, first within national boundaries and eventually in the world as a whole, with a controlled production and distribution of wealth for the public good. How this is to be brought about is another matter, but it is clear that the good of a nation or of mankind must not be held up because some people who profit by the existing order object to the change. If political or social institutions stand in the way of such a change, they have to be removed. To compromise with them at the cost of that desirable and practical ideal would be a gross betrayal. Such a change may partly be forced or expedited by world conditions, but it can hardly take place without the willing consent or acquiescence of the great majority of the people concerned. They have, therefore, to be converted and won over to it. Conspiratorial violence of a small group will not help. Naturally, efforts must be made to win over even those who profit by the existing system, but it is highly unlikely that any large percentage of them will be converted. The khadi movement, hand spinning and hand weaving, which is Gandhiji's special favorite, is an intensification of individualism in production, and is thus a throwback to the pre-industrial age. As a solution of any vital present-day problem, it cannot be taken seriously, and it produces a mentality which may become an obstacle to growth in the right direction. Nevertheless, as a temporary measure, I am convinced that it has served a useful purpose, and it is likely to be helpful for some time to come, so long as the state itself does not undertake the rightful solution of agrarian and industrial problems on a country-wide scale. There is tremendous unrecorded unemployment in India and even greater partial unemployment in rural areas. No attempt has been made by the state to combat this unemployment or help in any way the unemployed. Economically, Khadi has been of some little help to these wholly and partially unemployed, and because this improvement has come from their own efforts, it has raised their self-respect and given them some feeling of confidence. The most marked result has indeed been a psychological one. Khadi tried with some success to bridge the gap between the city and the village. It brought nearer to each other the middle-class intelligentsia and the peasantry. Clothing has a marked psychological effect on the wearer as well as the beholder, and the adoption of the simple white khadi dress by the middle classes resulted in a growth of simplicity, a lessening of vulgarity and ostentation, and a feeling of unity with the masses. The lower middle classes no longer tried to ape the richer classes in the matter of clothes or feel humiliated in their cheaper attire. Indeed, they felt not only dignified, but a little superior to those who still flaunted silks and satins. Even the poorest felt something of this dignity and self-respect. It was difficult in a large khadi-clad gathering to distinguish between the rich and the poor, and a spirit of camaraderie grew up. Khadi undoubtedly helped the Congress to reach the masses. It became the uniform of national freedom. Khadi also became a check on the ever-present tendency of the mill owners to raise the prices of their stuffs. These mill owners in India were only kept in check in the past by foreign competition, especially that of Lancashire. Whenever this competition ceased, as during the World War, cloth prices soared up in India to extraordinary heights and vast sums were made by the Indian mills. The Swadeshi and foreign cloth boycott movements later on also helped these mills greatly, but the presence of khadi made a difference, and prices could not go up as high as they might otherwise have done. Indeed, the mills exploited the khadi sentiment of the people, and so did Japan, by manufacturing coarse cloths which were almost indistinguishable from the hand-spun and hand-woven article. In the event of another emergency arising, like a war, resulting in a stoppage of foreign cloth, it is unlikely now that the Indian mill owners will be able to exploit the consumers to the extent they did from 1914 onwards. The Khadi movement will prevent that, and the Khadi organization has the capacity in it to spread out at short notice. In spite of all these present-day advantages of the Khadi movement in India, it seems to me, after all, a transitional affair. It may continue even later on as an auxiliary movement easing the changeover to a higher economy. But the main drive in future will have to be a complete overhauling of the agrarian system and the growth of industry. No tinkering with the land and a multitude of commissions costing lakhs of rupees and suggesting trivial changes in the superstructure will do the slightest good. The land system which we have is collapsing before our eyes, and it is a hindrance to production, distribution, and any rational and large-scale operations. Only a radical change in it, putting an end to the little holdings and introducing organized collective and cooperative enterprises, and thus increasing the yield greatly with much less effort, will meet modern conditions. The land will not and cannot absorb all our people, and large-scale operations will, as Gandhiji fears, lessen the workers required on the land. The others must turn, partly it may be, to small-scale industry, but in the main to large-scale socialized industries and social services. Khadi has certainly brought some relief in many areas, but this very success that it has attained has an element of danger. It means that it is propping up a decaying land system and delaying, to that extent, the changeover to a better system. The effect is not substantial enough to make a marked difference, but the tendency is there. For the tenant or the small peasant proprietor, his share of the produce of the land is no longer enough to keep him going even on the very low level he has reached. He has to find extraneous aids to his meagre income or, as he does usually, get more into debt in order to pay his rent or revenue. The additional income thus helps the landlord or the state to realize their share which otherwise they might be unable to do. In the event of the additional income being substantial enough, it is likely eventually the rent will rise and catch up to it. Under the present system, most of the additional labor of the tenant and his attempts to be thrifty will ultimately benefit the landlord. As far as I can remember, Henry George, in his Progress and Poverty, has dealt with this point, giving instances, especially of Ireland. Gandhiji's attempt to revive village industries is an extension of his Khadi program. It will do immediate good, part of it more or less permanent, most of it temporary. It will help the villager in his present distress and revive certain artistic and cultural values which were in danger of dying. But in so far as it is a revolt against machinery and industrialism, it will not succeed. In a recent article on village industries in the Harijan, Gandhiji writes, "Mechanization is good when hands are too few for the work intended to be accomplished. It is an evil when there are more hands than required for the work, as is the case of India. The problem with us is not how to find leisure for the teeming millions inhabiting our villages. The problem is how to utilize their idle hours, which are equal to the working days of 6 months in the year. This objection applies in varying measure to all the countries suffering from unemployment. But the fault surely is not that there is not work to do, but that under the present profit system, the work is not profitable enough to the employers. There is an abundance of work simply calling out to be done. The building of roads, irrigation schemes, houses, the spread of sanitation and medical facilities, of industry, electricity, social and cultural services, education, and the provision of the scores of necessary articles that the people lack. All our millions can work hard for the next 50 years without exhausting the present possibilities. But that can only be done if the urge is social improvement and not the profit motive, and if the community organizes it for the general good. The Russian Soviet Union, whatever other shortcomings it may possess, has no unemployed. Our people are idle not for lack of work, but because no facilities for work and cultural improvement are provided for them. The abolition of child labor, the provision of compulsory education up to a reasonable age, would take boys and girls off from the ranks of labor or the unemployed and relieve the labor market of the weight of tens of millions of prospective workers. Gandhiji has tried, with some success, to improve the charkha and the takli and increase their productive capacities. That is an attempt to improve the tool and the machine, and if the improvement continues, it is quite conceivable to have cottage industries worked by electricity. The profit motive will again step in and produce what is called overproduction and unemployment. Village industries, without being tacked on to some modern industrial technique, can never provide even the essential material and cultural goods that we need today. And they cannot compete with the machine. Is it desirable or possible for us to stop the functioning of big-scale machinery in our country? Gandhiji has said repeatedly that he is not against machinery as such. He seems to think that it is out of place in India today. But can we wind up the basic industries, such as iron and steel, or even the lighter ones that already exist? It is obvious that we cannot do so. If we have railways, bridges, transport facilities, etc., we must either produce them ourselves or depend on others. If we want to have the means of defense, we must not only have the basic industries, but a highly developed industrial system. No country today is really independent or capable of resisting aggression unless it is industrially developed. One basic industry demands another for its support and as a complement to it, and finally we have the machine-building industry itself. With all these basic industries functioning, it is inevitable that the lighter industries should spread. There is no stopping this process, for not only is our material and cultural progress bound up with it, but also our freedom itself. And the more big industry spreads, the less can small-scale village industries compete with it. They may have some chance of survival under a socialist system, but none under capitalism, and even under socialism they can only exist as cottage industries, specializing in particular goods which are not manufactured on a mass scale. Some Congress leaders are frightened of industrialization and imagine that the present-day troubles of the industrial countries are due to mass production. That is a strange misreading of the situation. Footnote: Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel speaking at Ahmedabad on January 3, 1935. True socialism lies in the development of village industries. We do not want to reproduce in our country the chaotic conditions prevalent in the Western countries consequent on mass production. End of footnote. If the masses lack anything, is it bad to produce it in sufficient quantities for them? Is it preferable for them to continue in want rather than have mass production? The fault obviously is not in the production but in the folly and inadequacy of the distributive system. Another difficulty which the promoters of village industries have to face is the dependence of our agriculture on the world market. The peasant is forced to grow commercial crops and to depend on world prices. While these prices vary, he has to pay his rent or revenue in hard cash. He has to raise this money somehow, or at any rate he tries to do so, and so he sows the crops which he thinks will bring him the best price. He cannot afford to grow what he himself needs to make himself and his family self-sufficient even in the matter of food. In recent years, the fall in agricultural prices of most food grains and other articles suddenly led millions of the peasantry, especially in the UP and Bihar, to cultivate sugar cane. A tariff on sugar had resulted in sugar factories cropping up like mushrooms, and sugar cane was in great demand. But the supply was soon far in excess of the demand, and the factory owners cruelly exploited the peasantry, and the price fell. These few considerations and a host of others seem to me to exclude the possibility or the desirability of any narrow autarchical solution of our agrarian and industrial problems. Indeed, they affect every phase of our national life. We cannot take refuge in vague and emotional phrases, but must face these facts and adapt ourselves to them so that we may become the subjects of history instead of being its helpless objects. Again, I think of the paradox that is Gandhiji. Footnote: In one of his speeches at the Round Table Conference in London in 1931, Gandhiji said, "Above all, the Congress represents in its essence the dumb, semi-starved millions scattered over the length and breadth of the land in its 700,000 villages, no matter whether they come from British India or what is called Indian India, Indian states. Every interest which, in the opinion of the Congress, is worthy of protection has to subserve the interests of these dumb millions." And so you do find now and again apparently a clash between several interests, and if there is a genuine, real clash, I have no hesitation in saying, on behalf of the Congress, that the Congress will sacrifice every interest for the sake or the interest of these dumb millions. End of footnote. With all his keen intellect and passion for bettering the downtrodden and oppressed, why does he support a system, and a system which is obviously decaying, which creates this misery and waste? He seeks a way out, it is true, but is not that way to the past barred and bolted? And meanwhile he blesses all the relics of the old order which stand as obstacles in the way of advance, the feudal states, the big zamindaris and talukdaris, the present capitalist system. Is it reasonable to believe in the theory of trusteeship, to give unchecked power and wealth to an individual, and to expect him to use it entirely for the public good? Are the best of us so perfect as to be trusted in this way? Even Plato's philosopher kings could hardly have borne this burden worthily. And is it good for the others to have even these benevolent supermen over them? But there are no supermen or philosopher kings. There are only frail human beings who cannot help thinking that their own personal good or the advancement of their own ideas is identical with the public good. The snobbery of birth, position, and economic power is perpetuated, and the consequences in many ways are disastrous. Again, I would repeat that I am not at present considering the question of how to effect the change, of how to get rid of the obstacles in the way, by compulsion or conversion, violence or non-violence. I shall deal with this aspect later, but the necessity for the change must be recognized and clearly stated. If leaders and thinkers do not clearly envisage this and state it, how can they expect even to convert anybody to their way of thinking, or develop the necessary ideology in the people. Events are undoubtedly the most powerful educators, but events have to be properly understood and interpreted if their significance is to be realized, and properly directed action is to result from them. I have often been asked by friends and colleagues who have occasionally been exasperated by my utterances, "Have you not come across good and benevolent princes, charitable landlords, well-meaning and amiable capitalists?" Indeed I have. I myself belong to a class which mixes with these lords of the land and owners of wealth. I am a typical bourgeois, brought up in bourgeois surroundings, with all the early prejudices that this training has given me. Communists have called me a petty bourgeois with perfect justification. Perhaps they might label me now one of the repentant bourgeoisie. But whatever I may be is beside the point. It is absurd to consider national, international, economic and social problems in terms of isolated individuals. Those very friends who question me are never tired of repeating that our quarrel is with the sin and not the sinner. I would not even go so far. I would say that my quarrel is with a system and not with individuals. A system is certainly embodied to a great extent in individuals and groups, and these individuals and groups have to be converted or combated. But if a system has ceased to be of value and is a drag, it has to go, and the classes or groups that cling to it will also have to undergo a transformation. That process of change should involve as little suffering as possible, but unhappily suffering and dislocation are inevitable. We cannot put up with a major evil for fear of a far lesser one, which in any event is beyond our power to remedy. Every type of human association, political, social, or economic, has some philosophy at the back of it. When these associations change, this philosophical foundation must also change in order to fit in with it and to utilize it to the best advantage. Usually, the philosophy lags behind the course of events, and this lag creates all the trouble. Democracy and capitalism grew up together in the 19th century, but they were not mutually compatible. There was a basic contradiction between them, for democracy laid stress on the power of the many, while capitalism gave real power to the few. This ill-assorted pair carried on somehow because political parliamentary democracy was in itself a very limited kind of democracy and did not interfere much with the growth of monopoly and power concentration. Even so, as the spirit of democracy grew, a divorce became inevitable, and the time for that has come now. Parliamentary democracy is in disrepute today, and as a reaction from it, all manner of new slogans fill the air. Because of this, the British government in India becomes more reactionary still and makes it an excuse for withholding from us even the outer forms of political freedom. The Indian princes, strangely enough, make this a justification for their unchecked autocracy and stoutly declare their intention of maintaining medieval conditions in their domains, such as exist nowhere else in the world. Footnote: the Maharaja of Patiala, Chancellor of the Chamber of Princes, speaking in the chamber at Delhi on January 22, 1935, referred to the opinion of Indian politicians who favor federation in the hope that the princes would be forced by circumstances to introduce democratic forms of government. He went on to say that, while the princes of India have always been willing to do what was best for their people and will be ready to accommodate themselves and their constitutions to the spirit of the times, we must frankly say that if British India is hoping to compel us to wear on our healthy body politic the Nessus shirt of a discredited political theory, they are living in a world of unreality. See also page 501 ante for Mysore Diwan's speech. Speaking on the same day in the Chamber of Princes, the Maharaja of Bikaner said, "We, the rulers of the Indian states, are not soldiers of fortune, and I take the liberty of stating that we who, through centuries of heredity, can claim to have inherited the instincts of rule and, I trust, a certain measure of statesmanship, should take the utmost care to safeguard against our being stampeded in a hurry to any hasty or ill-considered decision. May I in all modesty say that the princes have no intention of allowing themselves to be destroyed by anybody, and that should the time unfortunately come when the Crown is unable to afford the Indian states the necessary protection in fulfillment of its treaty obligations, the princes and states will die fighting to the bitter end. End of footnote. But the failure of parliamentary democracy is not that it has gone too far, but that it did not go far enough. It was not democratic enough because it did not provide for economic democracy, and its methods were slow and cumbrous and unsuited to a period of rapid change. The Indian states represent today probably the extremist type of autocracy existing in the world. They are, of course, subject to British suzerainty, but the British government interferes only for the protection or advancement of British interests. It is really astonishing how these feudal old world enclaves have carried on with so little change right into the middle of the 20th century. The air is heavy and still there, and the waters move sluggishly, and the newcomer, used to change and movement and a little weary of them perhaps, feels a drowsiness, and a faint charm steals over him. It all seems unreal, like a picture where time stands still and an unchanging scene meets the eye. Almost unconsciously he drifts back to the past and to his childhood's dreams, and visions of belted and armoured knights and fair and brave maidens come to him, and turreted castles and chivalry and quixotic ideas of honour and pride and matchless courage and scorn of death. Especially if he happens to be in Rajputana, that home of romance and of vain and impossible deeds. But soon the visions fade and a sense of oppression comes. It is stifling and difficult to breathe, and below the still or slow-moving waters there is stagnation and putrefaction. One feels hedged, circumscribed, bound down in mind and body. And one sees the utter backwardness and misery of the people, contrasting vividly with the glaring ostentation of the prince's palace. How much of the wealth of the state flows into that palace for the personal needs and luxuries of the prince? How little goes back to the people in the form of any service? Our princes are terribly expensive to produce and to keep up. What do they give back for this lavish expense on them? A veil of mystery surrounds these states. Newspapers are not encouraged there, and at the most a literary or semi-official weekly might flourish. Outside newspapers are often barred. Literacy is very low, except in some of the southern states, Travancore, Cochin, etc., where it is far higher than in British India. The principal news that comes from the States is of a viceregal visit, with all its pomp and ceremonial and mutually complimentary speeches, or of an extravagantly celebrated marriage or birthday of the ruler, or an agrarian rising. Special laws protect the princes from criticism, even in British India, and within the States the mildest criticism is rigorously suppressed. Public meetings are almost unknown, and even meetings for social purposes are often banned. Leading public men from outside are frequently prevented from entering the States. Footnote: a press message from Hyderabad, Deccan, dated October 3, 1934, states, "A public meeting to celebrate Mr. Gandhi's birthday, announced to be held in the local Vivekvadini Theatre yesterday, had to be abandoned. The meeting was organized by the Hyderabad Harijan Sevak Sangh, servants of the Untouchable Society. The secretary of the society, in a letter to the press, stated that 24 hours before the time of the meeting, the authorities demanded that permission to hold the meeting could only be granted on condition that a cash security of 2,000 rupees was furnished, and an undertaking given that no speeches of a political nature should be delivered, and no official actions of government officers should be criticized. As this gave the convener insufficient time to readjust matters with the authorities, the meeting had to be abandoned." End of footnote. In the middle 20s, Mr. C.R. Das was very ill, and he decided to go to Kashmir to recuperate. He was not on a political mission. He journeyed right up to the Kashmir border, but was stopped there. Even Mr. M.A. Jinnah was debarred from entering Hyderabad state, and Mrs. Sarojini Naidu, whose home is in Hyderabad city, was not permitted to go there for a long period. When such conditions prevail in the states, it would have been natural for the Congress to stand up for the elementary rights of the people of the states and to criticize their wholesale suppression. but Gandhiji fathered a novel policy on the Congress in regard to the states, the policy of non-interference in the internal administration of the states. This hush-hush policy has been adhered to by him in spite of the most extraordinary and painful occurrences in the states, and in spite of wholly unprovoked attacks by the states' governments on the Congress. Apparently the fear is that Congress criticism might offend the rulers and make it more difficult to convert them. In a letter written in July 1934 by Gandhiji to Mr. N.C. Kelkar, the president of the State Subjects Conference, he reiterated his conviction that the policy of non-interference was both wise and sound, and the view he took of the legal and constitutional position of these states was most extraordinary. The states, he wrote, are independent entities under British law. That part of India which is described as British has no more power to shape the policy of the states than it has, say, that of Afghanistan or Ceylon. It is not surprising that even the mild and moderate Indian States People's Conference and the Liberals took exception to his views and his advice. But these views were welcome enough to the rulers of the states, and they took advantage of them. Within a month, the Travancore government banned the National Congress in its territories and stopped all its meetings and its enrollment of members. In doing so, it stated that responsible leaders had themselves given this advice, obviously hinting at Gandhiji's statement. This ban, it might be noted, was after the withdrawal of the Civil Disobedience Movement in British India. The states had never been involved in the movement, and when the Congress had been declared a legal organization again by the Government of India. It is also interesting to note that the chief political advisor of the Travancore government at the time was, and still is, Sir C. P. Ramaswamy Iyer, once a General Secretary of the Congress as well as of the Home Rule League, later a Liberal, and the holder of high office in the Government of India and the Madras government. In accordance with the Congress policy, following Gandhiji's advice, not a word was said in public about this unprovoked attack on the Congress in normal times by the Travancore government. Footnote: Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel laid stress on this non-intervention policy in a speech at Baroda on January 6, 1935. He is reported to have said that workers in Indian states should do their work with all the limitations imposed by the state, and instead of criticizing the administration, efforts should be made to keep up cordial relations between the ruler and the ruled. End of footnote. Some of the liberals even protested against it vigorously. Indeed, Gandhiji's position in regard to the states is far more moderate and restrained than that of the liberals. Perhaps among the leading public men, only Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, with his close contacts with numerous princes, is equally restrained and solicitous of not offending the susceptibilities of the rulers. Gandhiji was not always so cautious in regard to the Indian princes. On a famous occasion in February 1916, during the inauguration ceremonies of the Hindu University at Benares, he addressed a meeting presided over by one of the princes and attended by a host of other princes. He had freshly returned from South Africa, and the burden of all India politics was not yet on his shoulders. Earnestly, and with a prophet's fire, he addressed them and told them to mend their ways and give up their vain pomp and luxury. "Princes, go and sell your jewels," he said, and though they may not have sold their jewels, they certainly went. In great consternation, one by one and in small groups, they left the hall, and even the president trooped out, leaving the speaker to carry on by himself. Mrs. Annie Besant, who was present then, was also offended at Gandhiji's remarks, and withdrew from the meeting. In his letter to Mr. N.C. Kelkar, Gandhiji says further, "I would like the states to grant autonomy to their subjects, and would like the princes to regard themselves and be, in fact, trustees for the people over whom they rule. If there is anything in this idea of trusteeship, why should we object to the claim of the British government that they are trustees for the government of India? Except for the fact that they are foreigners in India, I see no difference. There are almost equally marked differences as regards the color of the skin, racial origin and culture between various peoples in India. During the past few years, there has been a rapid permeation of British officials in Indian states, often thrust on an unwilling but helpless ruler. The government of India always exercised a great deal of control over the states from above. Now, in addition to this, there is an internal grip on some of the most important states, so that when these states speak, it is often the government of India speaking with another voice, but taking full advantage of the feudal background. I can understand that it is not always possible to indulge in the same activities in the states as elsewhere. Indeed, there are considerable differences, agrarian, industrial, communal, governmental, between the various British Indian provinces, and a uniform policy is not always feasible. But though action must depend on circumstances, our general policy should not vary in different localities, and what is bad in one place must be bad in another. Otherwise the charge will be made, and it has been made, that we have no consistent policy or principles, and all we are out for is to gain power for ourselves. A great deal of criticism has been directed, and quite rightly, against separate electorates for religious and other minorities. It has been pointed out that they are quite inconsistent with democracy. It is, of course, not possible to have democracy or what is called responsible government if the electorate is divided up into watertight religious compartments. But the most earnest and persistent of the critics, like Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya and the leaders of the Hindu Mahasabha, are singularly acquiescent in regard to the conditions in the states, and are apparently prepared to have a federal union between the autocracy of the states and the democracy, so it is called, of the rest of India. A more incompatible and absurd union it is difficult to imagine, but this is swallowed without an effort by the champions of democracy and nationalism in the Hindu Mahasabha. We talk of logic and consistency, but our basic urges continue to be emotional. And so I come back to the paradox of the Congress and the states. My mind travels to Thomas Paine, and the phrase he used about Burke nearly a century and a half ago. He pities the plumage, but forgets the dying bird. Gandhiji certainly never forgets the dying bird, but why so much insistence on the plumage? More or less the same considerations apply to the talukdari and big zamindari system. It hardly seems a matter for argument that this semi-feudal system is out of date and is a great hindrance to production and general progress. It conflicts even with a developing capitalism, and almost all over the world, large landed estates have gradually vanished and given place to peasant proprietors. I had always imagined that the only possible question that could arise in India was one of compensation. But to my surprise, I have discovered during the last year or so that Gandhiji approves of the talukdari system as such and wants it to continue. He said in July 1934 at Kanpur that better relations between landlords and tenants could be brought about by a change of hearts on both sides. If that was done, both could live in peace and harmony. He was never in favor of abolition of the talukdari or zamindari system, and those who thought that it should be abolished did not know their own minds. This last charge is rather unkind. He is further reported to have said, "I shall be no party to dispossessing propertied classes of their private property without just cause. My objective is to reach your hearts and convert you." He was addressing a deputation of big zamindars, "so that you may hold all your private property in trust for your tenants and use it primarily for their welfare. But supposing that there is an attempt unjustly to deprive you of your property, you will find me fighting on your side." The socialism and communism of the West is based on certain conceptions which are fundamentally different from ours. One such conception is their belief in the essential selfishness of human nature. Our socialism and communism should therefore be based on non-violence and on the harmonious cooperation of labor and capital, landlord and tenant. I do not know if there are any such differences in the basic conceptions of the East and West. Perhaps there are. But an obvious difference in the recent past has been that the Indian capitalist and landlord have ignored far more the interests of their workers and tenants than their Western prototypes. There has been practically no attempt on the part of the Indian landlord to interest himself in any social service for the tenants' welfare. A Western observer, Mr. H. N. Brailsford, has wrote in Property or Peace that Indian usurers and landlords are the most rapacious parasites to be found in any contemporary social system. The fault, perhaps, is not the Indian landlord's. Circumstances have been too much for him, and he has gone down progressively, and is now in a difficult position from which he can hardly extricate himself. Many landlords have been deprived of their lands by moneylenders, and the smaller ones have sunk to the position of tenants in the land they once owned. These moneylenders from the city advanced money on mortgages and foreclosed, and blossomed out into zamindars, and according to Gandhiji, they are now the trustees for the unhappy people whom they have themselves dispossessed of their lands, and are to be expected to devote their income primarily for the welfare of their tenantry. If the talukdari system is good, why should it not be introduced all over India? Large tracts of India have peasant proprietors. I wonder if Gandhiji would be agreeable to the creation of large zamindaris and talukas in Gujarat. I imagine not. But then why is one land system good for the UP or Bihar or Bengal, and another for Gujarat and the Punjab? Presumably there is not any vital difference between the people of the north and east and west and south of India, and their basic conceptions are the same. It comes to this, then, that whatever is should continue, the status quo should be maintained. There should be no economic enquiry as to what is most desirable or beneficial for the people, no attempts to change present conditions. All that is necessary is to change the people's hearts. That is the pure religious attitude to life and its problems. It has nothing to do with politics or economics or sociology. And yet Gandhiji goes beyond this in the political national sphere. Such are some of the paradoxes that face India today. We have managed to tie ourselves up into a number of knots, and it is difficult to get on till we untie them. That release will not come emotionally. What is better? Spinoza asked long ago. Freedom through knowledge and understanding, or emotional bondage. He preferred the former. End of chapter 62.